Yeah, so as she said, if you know us probably as the guys who built Lighttable, which was an IDE that was trying to make programming better. Kind of a vague goal, but the general idea was, hey, we could be so much faster if we could be connected to what we're doing. We could be so much more efficient if we could actually see what was going on in our programs. And so we built this thing, and we put it up on Kickstarter and raised a bunch of money, and yay, lots of people use it. But we started testing it, and we found out that at the end of the day, a tool can only do so much, that we were running into problems with the way we actually deal with programming, the way we think about how to program, what it means to program. And we just ran into a brick wall, rather. There was just nothing more we could do with the languages and the platforms as they existed now. And so that led us down this line of questioning of, okay, if you could start over, right? If you could just like redo all of it, what would that look like? And so, as she mentioned, our project that we're working on now is called Eve. And it's a little ambitious. It's a complete programming platform, and by that I mean a database, a language, and a development environment, because it wasn't enough the first time, which sounds a little crazy. But we've taken as an explicit constraint the idea that whatever we do has to be simple. And by simple, I mean of few parts. So if you think about how basically programming has evolved over the past 40, 50 years, we've kind of done like a depth-first traversal through the space of possibilities. We found object-oriented programming, and we just went way down to the bottom of it, right? And if you go back to the 70s, people had all sorts of crazy and interesting ideas. Some of them, a little before their time. Some of them computers weren't ready for, whatever. But we got down to the bottom, and now here we are kind of like looking around going, none of this really works the way we want it to, right? The world has changed. We don't have a single computer with a single CPU, with one hard disk, with a tiny little bit of RAM, right? Now we have these massive computers, but at the same time we have these guys, right? We have our thermostats are now part of the machine, and we have to be able to program them in some way, in some shape or form. And so Eve is a reimagining of programming by going back to basically first principles. What is the absolute simplest thing you could possibly do? And I'm going to show you a slightly older prototype. But what we came up with is something kind of unusual. And it's based on a bunch of research, interestingly enough, out of places like Berkeley. And you can kind of ignore the code on the side. I'm just showing it because that's part of the prototype. But everything in our language is actually just a table. At some level, you can think of this as kind of like a fancier version of SQL, a reactive version of SQL, where I have some users table, and it says, oh, I have the name of Chris, and he has age 27. I can add another person in here, right? I have Tom, and he's 57. And so that's in there. But the interesting thing is these aren't just tables that have numbers and stuff in them. They're actually views over information. So here's another one that calculates when all of us were born. And so the idea here is that you're actually creating views. That is the only thing you do inside of Eve. And you can build anything this way. So it's a very, very simple example. Let's look at this is one I love asking programmers to do. Put a button on the screen and have that button show the number of times it's been clicked. I have watched people take 30 minutes to accomplish that 3-line task. In Eve, it actually fits in a tweet. You basically want to create a view that's the increment button. And exactly as I said, you want to count the number of times the button has been clicked. And like I said, ignore this crazy-looking syntax. It'll all go away. But that's what this line expresses. Just simply, I want to aggregate over the list of events where the label is click, and I want to count the number of them. And so when I click on this guy, it goes up. And that does what I would expect. And we can actually see, I mentioned everything is a view. So if I type some stuff in here, we can actually see the events in the table, right? And they're just getting added. And all you're doing is expressing views over this essential state. And this scales up from, doing an incrementer button to, here's a clock, right? All of this stuff is live. There's nothing that you ever have to recompile. There's not even a notion of run. It just is. all the way up to to-do MVC, right? So here's a full implementation of to-do MVC. You type a bunch of things in here, click them on and off. And again, it's all just tables. And this scales all the way up, so here's the code for this editor that you see here. And I bring all this up, and the idea I said before was that this has to be simple. And we often take simple to mean that it works for a very small subset of things, or it works on very simple problems. But the truth is, the simplest solutions end up usually being the most powerful ones. And they have a lot of very interesting benefits. As an example, in a previous version of Eve, I built an entire IDE. I've done that a few times now. I built an entire IDE in a week, in 600 lines of code, in a language that didn't even have ordering in it, right? That's like wildly different. That's many, many orders of magnitude different, right? To give some perspective, Visual Studio is one of the top 10 largest pieces of software in the world, coming in at 55 million lines of code, right? We're talking massive amounts of complexity. What if we could just get rid of all of it? Right? What if we could start back at first principles and create a very, very simple system? It turns out that if you actually are able to do that, it's not just good for me. It's not just good for me to build another IDE, right? We don't care about that. It's not just good for you guys even. You guys are all programmers, right? If we can make programming simple enough, if we can turn it into tables, it starts to look like something that other people can do. It starts to look like Excel, right? It starts to look like something that 800 million people do every single day. And so that's what we're ultimately trying to do with Eve. We are trying to create a programming platform that, yeah, I can write an incremental compiler in it, and that's great, but that my co-founder as a biologist can focus on curing cancer, right? Or the guys at Stanford who are doing particle physics can be physicists, not programmers, in order to start building out their own sort of like computational workflows and stuff, right? The implications of a generation full of people capable of leveraging computers the same way that we do, or even half of what we can do, is absolutely tremendous. And so there you go. There's my little crazy pitch about Eve.